Well, welcome to Mothering in the Academia During a Pandemic. And I have to say, I'm loving what's going on in the chat. We're a little topic that we're talking about today. Warm welcome to all. My name is Nazila Kanlu. I'm an associate professor at the School of Nursing, Faculty of Health, York University, and I'm the academic lead for the Lillian Megan Wright scholarly program at York. And we have 3 moms who are involved in different capacities with the Academy, and I'll be introducing them to you shortly. So this is our website. If you wish to look at the website in due time for the posting of today's event. And we have Twitter accounts. Those are the Twitter accounts as well. And Becca, as you put on your presentation PowerPoint, I'll introduce you. Although many folks know you, but I have to say, Dr. Becca Pillai-Rydell has been a big supporter of the Lillian Megan Wright Academy ever since its inception. She's presented to us in the past, so thank you, Becca, and also her students have been successful in getting scholarships and participating in different capacities. She is the Associate Vice President Research and Professor, also a professor in the Department of Psychology. She's the Director of the Ouch Lab, and she's a member of the College of the Royal Society of Canada. Dr. Pillai-Rydell is the inaugural York Research Chair in Pain and Mental Health, and this is an area she is known nationally and internationally. So without further ado, Becca, if you want to share with us your wise ideas on how you're managing all that you're doing, we'd appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Nazila. And thank you to the Lillian Megan Wright Foundation for all the educational events that they host. And particularly, I'm so personally been grateful for their support of my graduate students over the years. Their support has been integral. So this is me, a picture of me representing me at about 6 p.m. every day. I have some pretty intense days. They've always been intense as I try and balance being a leader in the university, but also a researcher and a mother myself. What I thought was really interesting, and it really caught my attention about when Nazila asked me to participate, was the idea of the concept of mothering. And I think as an academic, the concept of mothering has been expanded for me. I would have never used that in a professional context, where now when you actually look at the definition of mothering, the idea of bringing up your child, which we traditionally think about, but it's also to look after someone kindly and protectively, sometimes excessively so. So I don't know about the excessively so, but definitely the idea that we're having to think about others in a professional context and their needs, which again, in turn is an added responsibility for mothers during the pandemic in academia. So you'll see the pictures that I use are actually just a subtle nod to how I've been, one of the things I've been coping through the pandemic. And I have been discovering the beauty of the area within an hour of my house. And so we've really been out. So all the pictures that you'll see that I've used is actually a part of my coping mechanism as a mother in academia. And they're actually shots that have been taken over the past year in my journey. So one of the things I think is really important is this idea of understanding that we're balancing more mothering as academics. So I think now many of us have our kids at home. My kids have been home since March 2020. So this idea of being a teacher to our children in a way that we never would have envisioned before. The idea of mother and essential caregiver. So now people who originally could go out and get groceries or navigate public spaces often can't. So many women are actually in this situation where they're having to do additional caregiving as essential caregivers, as people can't navigate the system, can't get access to vaccines. And we're doing all of these extra responsibilities with our family and our family networks as mothers. But then as professors, and that's the role I'll be speaking from, there's this idea that there's also a lot of emotion, a lot of stress out there. The idea that sometimes we're interacting as therapists, as social workers, trying to help them navigate the world and how they can come back, or if they're foreign students or if they're foreign professors, this idea that we're actually trying to help and be involved in more, because the pandemic has put these added responsibilities of, and if we're talking about showing care and concern, I wouldn't have ever really been worried about someone before about whether or not they were vaccinated. Where now, when someone says we can't get a hold of a vaccine, there's that personal responsibility, if you've been vaccinated, to kind of help. And I think the other piece is that, and even being in this role here, giving a talk, is that, I think as leaders, as professors, as people in university, we think about ourselves as role models, but this idea of how we're coping in the pandemic is also another dimension where you're kind of trying to pull back the curtain about stressors, where I don't think I really would have shared the amount of stress that I live in a life. But I think that there's something, again, that's really important in the role that I hold, to sort of share the struggles and how I'm coping. So not only are there new roles, there are new types of mothering. And so in how we care for our families and how we care for people and colleagues, to be safely rooted, because we are rooted in a spot. You'd think without traveling, there would be less liability. But the idea is that actually, to be safely rooted, we actually have to understand infectious diseases. We have to be aware and police, even with our own children, public health policy policing. There's lobbying and peacekeeping to be done when people don't actually have the same beliefs about the pandemic, about how the pandemic is infectious, whether it's dangerous, whether we should be masking, social gathering and vaccinating, and even fortune telling. So this is a really new type of thing that, because it has entered in, while we're always trying to think about forecasting and planning, we're actually trying to think about what the world will be like, what we will be allowed to do, and make plans in our lives as family members, as mothers, as leaders in our family, but also as leaders in academia, and how we are, and professors in our labs, in our research spaces. So the amount of stress that is upon us is greater. The impossibility of our lives has never been more true. I think we talk about deceiving our daughters, this idea that you can have it all. You can have this high-powered career and be everything to your children and everything to your husband is nothing new. But the pandemic has added whole new responsibilities. Our dependence on other people to support our homes, whether it's for cleaning or for childcare or other aspects that have helped us make that balance, a lot of that was taken away during the pandemic and putting us in this impossible situation. We just have to acknowledge we cannot be everything to everyone. And it's really important to understand, and I'm going to make a strong statement here, and it's because I've had to make it to myself. I don't think it will be true for everybody, but for myself, this idea, sorry, this screen is here, put it that way. It's actually selfish to not engage in self-care. Given the amount of people that depend, and I'll make it very personal so that I'm not being judgmental of others, but it's really come down to, I have never been great at self-care. But during the pandemic, this has really changed. And it was really a statement my husband made to me in anger, to say, if you don't take care of yourself, like, what would we do? And it was in that moment that I started really realizing that it is actually selfish if I don't take care of myself. So as I switch in this talk now to talking about some tips that I've had and how I've managed that, I want to impress upon all the mothers out there, as we talk about mothering, that taking care of yourself is actually the first foundational step. I don't think it's actually an optional step. And so as we mother, as professors, as mothers, as students, that we think about that. So some of the things I have to tell myself constantly as I live and work very long days. I get up at 4 or 5 in the morning, and I'm on the go until 6 straight. I often take minor breaks only to check on the kids. And these long days have been made even longer because of a lot of additional pandemic responsibilities. And I've realized a few things. I have to actually do less to be able to do more. So it's this interesting idea that if I'm stretched so thin that because of the additional pandemic responsibilities in my life, and I don't do this anymore, but just an example would be just the time it takes to bring groceries into their house. There was a time where I was wiping down everything because the data wasn't clear that contact surface contaminants couldn't pass the virus on. And so just the pandemic has added things. And I had to make room in my professional and mothering life for those pandemic responsibilities. At the beginning, I didn't do that. I was just trying to do it all. But for me to keep going, I had to do less so that I could actually do more, because it was untenable to add pandemic responsibilities of life and living on top of my normal schedule. I started learning to do the least I possibly can to get the most return. So it's not that I'm putting 50% efforts, but there are times I'm putting 85. And I was someone who always prided myself on always doing the 110% effort. Not anymore. I really take my thought process and very quickly and efficiently now try and think about things. It's like, does this need an hour of my time, or can I do it in a half hour? I have stopped I have started, doing half-hour meetings and 45-minute meetings, something I never did before. And again, that's only because trying to more efficiently get through my day. Mothering and not being a mother. So really trying to actually have some distance from people who are struggling in some ways emotionally. So I think that we're all raw, and I can't take on the world's problems. And so I'm definitely someone who wants to mother colleagues and mother students and that sort of thing. But being careful, I draw a line that ultimately I am not their mother. And while I can show care and concern, that at some point, because everybody is so stressed, that I have to draw personal boundaries. And the other thing that I think, and it worries me about all women in academia, is not to forget about your future path. As we're trying to cope with today, the impact on our CVs and the impact on our research and on our professional attainment can take the sidecar. And really hoping to instill upon people to take some time as a part of self-care to actually plan for your own professional futures, to think about that, and not to just get so caught up in the day-to-day survival, which is easy to do, and to actually spend some time to think about the next award you want to apply for, the next papers you want to get out, the next course you want to take, because that's important for our professional fulfillment, right? That we are people who will be balancing academia and motherhood. That's something we will do our entire careers. And so it's just not forgetting that. And so my final slide is just something that I started last year in my own mind to remind myself every day. And I called it my mess. And it was making sure that every day, as a part of self-care, I moved, I ate something well, I slept, I tried to get as much sleep as possible, and I did things to manage my stress. And so the acronym for me is just, did I attend to my mess? Because that's what it really felt like. I wasn't moving. I can often be sitting, in front of a computer screen for 12 hours. And so using an elliptical, walking around my house during meetings. So if I can do a meeting, not on Zoom, but on a phone call, and actually just even walk around my house, I do that now. I'm also a card carrying, there's no real card, but I'd make it if I could, waterfall hunter. So some of these shots, I think we're in one of the waterfall capitals. We're in this region of waterfalls. And so it brings me great joy. And so I get out and do that. I'm making sure that I have an autoimmune condition, that I'm really paying attention to my diet. I pack my lunch and my kids' lunches so that we're all at the beginning of the day, because we've been home since March 2020, that we eat and that we have some good food. I try and avoid Netflix show holes, but it doesn't always happen. But then I do try and actually power nap. So one of the advantages of working at home is that if I do have a half-hour break, sometimes I'll spend 20 minutes of it taking a nap and power napping. And then in terms of just my stress level, I started seeing a therapist to help me online, just to help me manage and talk and focus about some of the things that to clear my head so that I could be stronger. I block catch-up days in my calendar now. Sometimes it will take me 8 weeks to get to one, but I'll block off days where I'm just catching up on email or catching up on thinking about what I need to do, because sometimes I get so busy, I don't even know, I'm just following what happens in my calendar. So trying to block entire days that I can just think about organizing, shutting down during the day where I try. It doesn't often happen during the workday, but definitely my shutdowns are during the weekend. So not letting work leak in and having some time where I'm not with the kids. So because they're at school, there's school at home, we're all in the house together. We go out together because there's only so many places we can go, but trying to book some time for no time, for there's no kids, and I actually am not responsible to mother. So that's kind of my perspective in a nutshell.
Thank you very much, Becca. And I think, one of the aims of today is, especially for academics who are in leadership positions, for folks who are tenured, to start talking about the challenges of the pandemic for mothering while being in academia, and kind of to normalize it, that to build a community in talking about our challenges, that we're all affected. But to normalize it, folks have to start talking about it so that we don't feel alone in going through the emotions, going through what the pandemic has done for us, both personally and career-wise, to our families, to our communities. So thank you very much for that honest and transparent presentation. Andrea, as you put up your PowerPoint, I'll introduce you as well. Andrea is currently completing her PhD in the Clinical Developmental Psychology program here at York, but very delighted that she's is our student co-chair of the Lillian Megan Wright Maternal Child Health Scholars Program. And her own research focuses on supporting the well-being of parents of children with autism. And her dissertation is looking at an evaluation of acceptance and commitment therapy for improving mental health and positive functioning in parents of individuals with autism. And Andrea, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nazila. So I'll be speaking today about the experience of early first-time motherhood during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm focusing my talk on those who have had a baby either just before or during the pandemic. I'll cover a little bit of literature, and I'll share some reflections I have as a new and first-time mother myself. And just before I start, I recognize that the pandemic has been incredibly difficult, for everyone for many different reasons. And I want to talk about a set of reasons why this can be the case for new mothers. But it's not to say that it's harder for new mothers than other mothers or fathers or other caregivers or people who aren't parents. I don't mean to weigh hardship, just to shed light on a specific, unique experience that I can speak to. So let's talk about a non-crisis time. So, what's the typical experience like for first-time mothers? If they have personal concerns, what do they tend to be? So, physical health issues can arise from pregnancy, delivering, caring for a baby. Mental health concerns are common. Many require more practical, informational, and peer support than they ever have before. Some experience the postpartum period as an intense loss of freedom resulting from the demands of caring for an infant. And, issues can arise in interpersonal relationships, like trouble connecting to friends and family, one's partner, feeling really lonely if you're taking on the childcare mostly alone. And as I realized as I was reading about this typical experience and thinking about it, a lot of these challenges are really, present for most people right now as a result of the ongoing pandemic and multiple lockdowns. So a great many people are experiencing, physical and mental health concerns, or they're requiring more support or struggling with a loss of personal freedoms, and maintaining relationships is sometimes more challenging. So how I'm understanding the effect of the pandemic on new mothers is that there's an accumulation of stressors occurring. So first, there are the concerns of first-time motherhood that I discussed. And then, of course, the specific challenges of being in lockdown and the pandemic in general. So like financial losses, detrimental effects from social isolation, etc. And then finally, the pandemic has amplified gender disparities already impacting women. So during the pandemic, women may be more likely to take on more of the household labor and childcare, or make sacrifices in their careers to care for other family members, etc. And these stressors, I think, combine to create a specific and challenging set of circumstances for new and first-time mothers. So I want to talk a little bit in more detail about the pandemic, the effect of the pandemic on postpartum mental health. So I was wondering, normally, how many women are experiencing distress in the postpartum period? And this varies sample to sample, but over and over again in my review, this number came up. So during the year following birth, about 1 in 7 women are screened in for experiencing clinically significant mood disorders. And then, so what has the effect of the pandemic been on mental health? So here's just a quick summary of some of the studies that I've found conducted in Europe and North America. They use the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Survey within the year after birth. So it's just a screening tool, not a formal diagnosis, and then different studies use different time points, etc. But just as a glimpse, for example, in North America, the range is 35 to 40% now experiencing depression. And then in Europe, a bit of a bigger range, but 27% in Portugal, for instance. So for most studies, we're talking about a gain from about 1 in 7 to 1 in 4 or 1 in 3. And and all the things that put certain mothers at greater risk are a lot of the things that you might expect. So women who score higher on a measure of loneliness, those who are first-time mothers, people who have experienced income disruption, those who report low levels of social support, women who are experiencing childcare issues, and those who have experienced trauma or other high levels of pain during birth. These are factors that are predicting higher levels of depression and other distress in the postpartum period during the pandemic specifically. So when we hear from mothers directly, we might not always be hearing about mental health problems, but that doesn't mean that there aren't difficulties. So new mothers' experiences during this time can be difficult to capture with questionnaires because we're feeling more ambiguous losses. So things that are hard, things that we've missed out on, but they don't fit into a clear category. So for example, for many new mothers, they realize that they'll be the only ones who have witnessed milestones in their child's first year. So extended family may never spend time with grandchildren or nieces or nephews while they're still babies. Mothers report feeling left behind when in-person support isn't available, even for things like learning breastfeeding, where it really helps to have in-person assistance. Mothers are saying that less attention is given to their own health after birth, and I know for a while many clinics weren't even offering well baby visits, and they were delaying routine vaccinations. Mothers aren't able to connect with other new parents or see other babies, so it's really difficult to get without a reference point to get a sense of what's normal for your own mental health and what's normal for your baby's development. The story isn't a negative one always for everyone. This qualitative study came out of Nova Scotia, 68 new mothers' responses to open-ended questions about their experiences with a young baby during the pandemic. The authors conceptualized their themes as like blessings and curses. So at the bottom, parents brought up things like isolation, robbed moments, limited socialization. But many mothers on the top, they named ways in which they felt that their experience had been somewhat improved by the time at home. So some mothers felt that they had more freedom to do things as they wished without trying to perform for others. Some felt like it was easier to bond and cuddle with their baby at home. Some learned more about their babies and about themselves without outside distractions. So the tagline for this webinar, we're meant to share with you helpful strategies for mothering during a pandemic, and I'll do my best to share some ideas that I have. Okay, so the first is recognizing ambiguous loss. And I'll give a personal example here. So my closest friend lives in the Caribbean. She would normally come home a few times a year. Because of the pandemic, she's never held or spent time with my son. And now that he's a toddler, she'll never hold him when he's a baby. This type of loss is really hard to quantify, but I think recognizing it as a real loss is an important part of coping. The term disenfranchised grief comes from bereavement literature, but it happens when we receive the message that a loss isn't legitimate and we don't deserve to grieve it. I think we all need to give ourselves during this time, ourselves and others, permission to grieve any kind of loss that we're experiencing. During the pandemic, we don't have babysitters or date nights or visitors, but we might be offered help in different forms, and we might have to call on partners to take on more. I think the pandemic has really increased the amount and the intensity of advice that new mothers get about how they should be parenting. Daycare or no daycare, bring your baby to the park, or definitely don't do that. Like, a lot of people have opinions about these things. I think it's okay to tune some of these things out and listen to your gut. A lot of support right now is going to be online, and it might be tempting to discount some of it as not as helpful. But I think there's a lot of value right now in connecting with other parents and other families or professionals just in the way that we're able to. And last, the first year of a child's life involves many milestones, and they look different in a pandemic. So I don't know how my child will behave in a restaurant or how he is with other children even. And I've learned that it's not useful to compare these things with other people who experienced their baby's first year before the pandemic, or to compare my situation in general to others. Okay, so I think the responsibility for maternal well-being can't only be with the mother, including during the pandemic. Here's a list of some, policy or systems level changes that I've seen recommended. The Ontario Maternal Mental Health Act is under discussion, I believe, this week, actually. So it proposes, an annual day to raise awareness and a provincial framework to improve postpartum care. Postpartum mothers, they are given some support with their physical health, and the majority of healthcare is really focused on infant care, but I think mental health and well-being should be valued as highly. If routine postpartum mental health screening and free public health support were provided in a more routine way, like it is with breastfeeding, for instance, problems could be identified earlier on. I've experienced that there's still some outdated messaging about how to mother babies and how to feed babies. I think if this were to change, like if mothers were routinely told things like fed is best, rather than being pushed toward a certain type of feeding, for example, it might be easier to cope when things don't go to plan in the postpartum period. And then expanding accessible and virtual care, I think will help get more mothers the support that they need. So that's all I had today. Thank you very much for hearing my thoughts. I have some reference slides.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And just listening to your presentation and how the pandemic has affected friends, family holding a young baby. I remember the last time I saw you in person was when you were very pregnant with our last Lydia Megan Wright Learning Academy. And it makes me feel sad how much young babies and young mothers are missing because of course, we have to follow social distancing directives, but listening to your presentation really underscored that, as well as your point about it's not just all on the mother's shoulders. We need systemic and structural support. I think that's a very important point. So thank you very much, and beautiful pictures of lovely Ari. Thank you. For having them on your PowerPoint.
Thank you,
I think as Marina puts up her presentation, I'll introduce you. And Marina's been a long-time affiliate of the Lydia Megan Wright Academy, too, both as a scholarship recipient as well as a presenter in past learning academies, and just an all-around big supporter. So thank you, Marina. Dr. Marina Heifetz is the child and adolescent psychologist and director of child and family services at York Region CBT. She's also a lecturer at the University of Toronto. She received her PhD in clinical developmental psychology from York University. And her postdoctoral work was with the neurodevelopmental department of the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And I know Marina and I both have an interest in mindfulness just from our Twitter accounts. So thank you, Marina. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to speak. I feel like I'm coming from a little bit of a different perspective. So I'm a mother of 3 kids, so that we have in common. And they're sort of all over in terms of age groups. So I have a 2-year-old, I have a 4-year-old, and I have a 9-year-old. So I'm sort of experiencing all the ups and downs that different developmental periods have to offer right now. And as Nazila has mentioned, I have an interest in mindfulness. So I'm also a clinician, and I've been lecturing at the University of Toronto. So for me, just as a quick summary of my background, I've always been interested in research as well as clinical. And because I had my first child, sort of like Andrea, I was in graduate school when I had my first. When I sort of finished my postdoc, I was pregnant with my second, and I decided to step back from academia because it felt like a lot at the time. So I chose that consciously and mindfully as a way to prioritize parenting, but it also sort of something at the back of my mind I've always wanted to kind of come back to. And so I'm really happy to be teaching right now. And we'll see. Each day I'm trying to take it one step at a time. But I guess I'll start by, hopefully today will be helpful in terms of some of the strategies that I've been finding helpful. And as Andrea mentioned, part of it is just accepting that, right now, nothing is really the way that we're used to, and things are a little bit all over the place. So some of these visuals you could probably relate to, just trying to figure out parenting duties with cooking and cleaning and all the Zoom meetings and the work. So I feel like I can relate to each of these visuals and just trying to balance that. My middle one is in JK, and doing online schooling is just not very practical. So it's been a tricky time. And so I always say I work clinically as well. And with my clients, I always say, it's okay to not be okay right now. That's just our reality. I thought I would introduce you to the stress model. I always find it helpful to see stress from different perspectives. So there is, this model, the stress model developed from Harvard University, where we talk about positive, tolerable, and toxic stress. The positive stress being things like, when we have to present, for example, like I'm doing right now, and we have a little bit of that stress, brief increases in heart rate, but it's positive in a way that it helps us grow, builds resilience. Tolerable is more of that serious temporary stress responses, but it's buffered by supportive relationships. So I think of COVID, I know it's been not as brief, but I'd like to think with the support of our relationships, we can place it as more of a tolerable stress. Where it gets toxic is when it's prolonged activation of stress response systems in the absence of protective relationships. So typically examples like, kids coming from abusive homes, right? And there's trauma involved, long-term impact of stress. So I thought I would start out with just a little bit of the research that's being done right now during the pandemic, as we're trying to understand what's going on and what impact it's having. So a recent study actually looked at mothers of school-aged children, and the nice thing about the study is it's longitudinal. So they've looked at these mothers sort of before COVID came, and then they've looked at that at their reports of mental health more recently of May and July of 2020. And as you can see, their depression and anxiety really increased, right? So they went from having 18 to 19% of them having depression and anxiety to increasing to 31 and 35%, right? So so quite a big jump. And as we know, maternal mental health problems are associated with poor child development as well. And this is just within that study, I highlighted these pieces as they were sort of the most significantly coming out as impactful. So what we see as impactful in terms of their mental health is that impact of COVID-19 on the employment, right, on our ability to do our work, as well as difficulty balancing homeschooling with work and other responsibilities. And for me personally, and I'll sort of come back to this point, this has been a big one that I've had to work through as well. I like to sort of check in with myself. I always use these check-ins when I teach, when I work with my clients. So I use it with myself as well as a way to check in how I'm doing. So this is a model that's been adapted based on how we're doing within this pandemic. You could be going up and down on this each day or even throughout the day. So just checking in with yourself, whether you've got this, whether you're feeling okay. But if something doesn't feel right, so if you're having trouble sleeping or eating, right, taking steps to try to, one step at a time, you can't fix it all, but taking steps to try to support yourself. Rebecca had talked a lot about self-care. I really like that idea of, I even wrote it down, Rebecca, doing less to do more. And that's something that I've also worked hard to do, to try to kind of fit more in this green to yellow area so that I feel like I've got this and I'm able to communicate, I'm able to focus and have good adaptive skills every day. Um, but at the same time, it's normal to have that smaller window of tolerance during stressful times. So because of that, I hope I'll be providing some strategies to help us stay within that window of tolerance. But it is much easier to either shut down or to blow up these days because our stress has really increased. Our capacity to carry that stress, um, is lowered right now. I really like this resilience building model as well. As you could see, I do a lot of visuals. So I really think that it's impactful in terms of our understanding. And so for here, you can see the fulcrum is sort of in the middle. And what we want to do, and we have one side, the negatives that are really impacting our stress, which could be for some of us, a job loss or even just that physical distancing that Andrew talked about, where you can't even see other mothers perhaps that you would like to see, having schools closed and dealing with kids at home, right, and helping them learn while at the same time trying to balance your own work is part of that negative. But what we want to do is try to load the positives so that that fulcrum moves a little bit to that side. And so some of these ones are general from the model, but some of the ones that I try to focus on are things like self-care, right? Making sure, checking in with myself, bringing in that mindful awareness of what am I thinking, what am I feeling right now, what's going on for me, and also checking in with my kids, right? Making sure that everything's okay for them. It's social support is a really big one, and I know that could look very different right now, but that's something that I've been focusing on to sort of load up on those positives as well. I always come back to, if you're familiar with Daniel Siegel's work, so he and his colleague David Rock developed this healthy mind platter that I really find helpful in the back of my mind to always check in on. And so sleep time is a big one. And as Rebecca mentioned, she tries to do power naps. I also try to kind of be mindful of that, and make sure that I'm getting enough sleep. Physical time. So again, trying to implement that, even if it's just I've recently started doing some regular yoga practices, and it's just, even if it's some days I only get 10 minutes in, it sets a tone for me, right? And I feel good about myself and about doing that. And again, I should mention, as we go through this healthy mind platter, sometimes some days we'll have more or less of that, and that's okay as well. It's just keeping these things in mind for our optimal functioning, having that focus time. And by that, what Daniel Siegel talks about is just being able to not multitask, but focus on one thing at a time, right? So I think it's really easy in our work to, try to do this and this and that, especially during the pandemic. So trying to actually slow down and do one thing at a time. The time in is just checking in with ourselves, right? So practicing that mindful awareness, what's going on for me internally, and if that stress is elevated, stepping back for a moment and taking care of ourselves. The downtime is really important. So just giving our brain a little bit of a break, which is really difficult for people in academia, I think, especially because, our go-tos, well, there's all this reading to do, all this writing to do, and there's a lot on the go. But it's a really important thing for us to sort of step back from it as well, as part of our self-care. Playtime, so just being silly. And I feel like that's something that I actually have to teach a lot of my parent clients, because we kind of forget how to have fun sometimes, right? So just sitting down, playing with your kids, or just being silly and goofy actually creates new neural connections in our brains, where we become more creative, right, by doing that. So it is important to take care of ourselves this way as well. And connecting time, as I mentioned, really just making sure we connect with others, whether it's virtually or at physical distance at some point. It's really important to keep that in mind as an important piece. On the other side, I have here, routines, right? So routines really help me, from my experience, thrive with these components of the healthy mind platters. So building in routines around physical time is a really important one for me, because if I don't build that in, I'm not likely to do that. But also lowering those expectations. Some days it's not going to get done, and that's okay. I always kind of say to myself, we need to have lower expectations right now, because we're not living through exactly the normal times. Flexibility, again, that comes back to expectations, being able to be flexible with ourselves, with our schedule, with our routines, and self-compassion and gratitude. And that's a big one that I try to practice. There's a lot of talk in the field right now around self-compassion fatigue as well. I think it's a big thing, especially, for me, I also work as a clinician. And so I tend to do a lot of listening and taking in. And so coming back to kind of taking care of myself and reflecting on what is important to me, reflecting my values, reflecting on what am I grateful for in this moment, is a really important one. And I've built that into our routine with the family as well. So each day, during dinner time, when we have dinner together, we try to kind of go around this table, and each one of us says something they really found special about that day. So that's our kind of gratitude practice each day. And our 2-year-old is quite involved in that as well and has a lot to say. So you can start it pretty early on with the kids as well. And then, of course, coming back to our expectations, sometimes, you will get distracted, and that's okay. So there's going to be days where, you try these things and they don't go the way that you plan. And you could see here, there's good days and challenging days, right? So this is a picture of my kids trying to do work online. And this is one of those moments where things were going well and they were being attentive, but, moments later, they kind of ran off, right? So there's going to be challenges along the way. The pandemic really, I think, gave us, on the positive side, gave us a lot of opportunity to explore nature. And so we go on a lot of hikes, a lot of natural experiences. And then see if I can play this with this quick clip.
Our watermelon died.
So hopefully you could hear that, but that's my middle one narrating that, I've never seen this happen to the watermelon, but it just felt like a good metaphor for how things could go sometimes. So, okay, so this is just a quick reminder for us to take a pause. So it's a triangle of awareness. I practice this as part of my mindfulness practice. Just to check in with ourselves. So taking that stop, right, and taking some slow, deep breath, checking in, seeing what is here and now, sensations, emotions, thoughts, and being curious about what you notice without making judgments. And I find that is a very helpful one because when I practice this triangle of awareness, I'm less reactive. It's really easy to become reactive, right? So by checking in with ourselves and bringing that, tuning into our emotions, our thoughts, our sensations, we can better sort of respond in a more mindful way to our children. I'll quickly just show you this. So Susan David has published recently a book called Emotional Agility. I really enjoy that read if anyone is interested, but essentially she talks a lot about emotion, and this is a pyramid sort of similar to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but she's sort of developed one based on our emotional journey. And just quickly kind of going through it in the interest of time, we have that gentle acceptance, just accepting that the situation can't be changed, but learning to we have control over what we can control, right? Compassion, meeting yourself where you are, applies to others as well, right? So for me, it's a really helpful tool as well with my children. When they're not paying attention, when they're getting distracted from the computer, I step back and notice, well, this is really hard for them as well. Routines, as I mentioned before, creating pockets of healthy routines and letting go of what you can't control. Connections and nurturing our relationships, because community is really important to our well-being. Courage, so staying open to tough emotions. They're expected, and identify what matters most to you, right? So it comes back to sort of being okay with sort of not feeling okay. Resets and make habits out of behaviors you have consciously chosen, and then you reach that wisdom. Life's beauty is inseparable from its fragility. So I'll end with this quote. I really like Viktor Frankl's work, so I thought this was fitting to end it with this. Between stimulus and response, there's a space, and in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. So for me, this is a good reminder that we still have, the biggest power we have is how we choose to respond to our environment, to others in our lives.
Great, thank you very much, Marina. You gave us a lot of pointers, but you also applied it to how you use it yourself as a mom, as a very busy mom, both as a clinician, as a academic, as well as having children in different developmental phases. So thank you very much. And I think like talking about it with others, normalizing that the experiences that we're feeling opens up the opportunities for change to happen. Because if we don't talk about it, if we don't normalize it, then we're going to assume that it's the entire onus is on us. And as a matter of fact, the pandemic has shown across diverse areas how gendered it is. So it's affecting women in different ways than it is affecting men. It's affecting parents in different ways than it is affecting men. So the pandemic has really exacerbated the pre-existing disparities, including the gender disparities. So I would say at this point, we made it on time. We had a full 1 hour session, and I really appreciate everyone joining in. I in particular appreciate our panel members bringing in a lot of ideas, but also referring to their own individual experiences. And let's keep the conversation going. I mean, let's just keep on talking about it within our families, friends, communities, but also within our work settings or educational settings. So let's talk about it. Let's normalize discussions around parenting, around mothering. And on that note, I wish you all a good day. Thank you so much, and please stay in touch. Thank you.